this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments on whatever platform you happen to be watching on. They will show up here in my chat room, or at least most of them will show up here in my chat room, and we can communicate directly. I will notice that it seems that there are some comments that don't show up um, from some of the platforms. I don't quite understand that, but most of them do. And so wherever you're watching, um, go ahead and type in whatever comments you may have, and we can talk directly. And I quite like that part of this broadcast. Now, yesterday, our subject was the idea of keeping on, keeping on. That one of the great habits of success is to keep doing what you do, to grow it, to evolve it, to change aspects of it, but to keep your focus and continue working on what your work is in life. And hello to Calvin. It's good to see you, Calvin. And Calvin comes to us from Raleigh, North Carolina. And today I thought I'd talk a little bit about some aspects of book writing, which has been one of the things I've kept on keeping on, that you might not think about. And the way that I came to this subject is that one of my projects for today is working on the editing of Reverend Don's Book of Astrology. The writing is now done. It's time for editing. And unless you're already an author, you probably don't really think a lot about editing. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. But the editing is a very important part of the process. Um, Depending on how you do it, it can be several parts of the process. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about that today. When you first write something, it's very rare that your first attempt is going to be your final attempt. What you're doing is you're getting the ideas out in an initial form that can later be polished. Now, depending on how you write it, depending on your voice in writing, that polishing may involve a number of things. For many people, well, for most everyone, it involves going through to make grammatical corrections, spelling corrections, things like that. Um, with very few exceptions, even when we're quite fastidious with such things, when we write a large piece of work, we're going to make the occasional mistake. I find that features such as autocorrect will sometimes cause a mistake that I don't realize has happened because I may actually have typed in the right thing and it corrected itself to something else. When I was writing Second Degree, this happened quite a lot with the chapter 11, which dealt with Asian um, symbolism in the Bagua and the Yi Jing. And some of those names autocorrected themselves into very bizarre things. And the only way to fix that was to go through by hand and look for them. And even then, making sure it didn't refix itself could be an issue. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. Um, this is one of the reasons that no matter how fastidious you are, you definitely need to do proofreading and editing. Because even if you did not do something that you may want to change, the process may have done it. But very often, you yourself will have done things that you want to change. Um, I find that um, it varies greatly from one author to another. For some authors, their first version of something is very rough, and then they go through, having gotten their ideas on paper, and polish up the way that it's expressed. That's not really true for me, but that doesn't mean there aren't things I'm going to want to change, maybe make a little more precise, a little clearer. One of the things that I try to look for is to make sure that if something needs to be explained, it is explained. Um, if something needs to be defined, it gets defined. And I don't always catch that every time. The first time, sometimes you need to go through. Um, Sometimes you want to neaten your language, perhaps. There is a big difference between spoken English and written English, and this has been an interesting feature of some of my works. I've talked about Reverend Don's books of questions, for example. Reverend Don's books of questions were done from my vlogs, which were spoken. They were done on video. And so they are not using what you'd call literary language, although I think my spoken English is closer to literary English than some people. But still, it's not how I would have necessarily written it, but it is how I said it. And because we were taking it from the vlog, we wanted to preserve that quality. And so in putting those books together, keeping the spoken quality, the sound of the spoken word was very important. Whereas in something like the degree lessons, I was being much more conscious of more formal writing while still trying to keep it accessible. Um, I also tend to have a rather eccentric writing style. I tend to use rather archaic rules for capitalization, for example, that have largely passed from everyday society, but I still insist on doing it for my own reasons. And hello to Tracy in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tracy. Um, in some of my books, we preserve that, and some of them we have not. Um, it has been a choice that we've made for different reasons on different occasions. Hello to Steve in the chat room. In my case, and I've spoken to how I learned to speak and to write, that there were many different heterogeneous influences in my accent, in the way that I phrase things. And hello to Christine in the chat room. It's good to see you, Christine. And part of this was the presence of Midwestern English, transatlantic English, and RP English all together in the household and family where I grew up, with no particular explanation to the differences between them. And so it was very idiosyncratic how that affected me. And also the influence of languages such as Latin and German, which have tended to influence my pronunciation of certain things. Um, and I think that when you speak multiple languages, either fluently or even just a little bit, it may tend to influence all of them, not just individual ones, depending on, I guess, how you apply it. Um, and when it comes to things like grammar and punctuation, I'm heavily influenced by 19th century sources because a lot of the things I read growing up and still today are of 19th century origin, and they tend to address things in a somewhat different manner. I often say that Grammarly hates me because it hates that 19th century way of doing things. But I still find it useful personally. I find it a little more gracious way of approaching expression, and certainly far less businesslike, but I'm not doing business writing. I also extensively studied Middle English and early modern English, which I think is where a lot of my eccentric capitalization comes from. I tend to follow more the style of that time, which you still see in languages such as German, but much less in English. And I don't particularly care if I'm a little archaic. Um, and a little idiosyncratic. Because if you look for anyone who writes exactly the way that I do, you're probably not going to find them. And that's okay with me, but then that's also because of the things that I'm writing. If I were writing, well, again, if I were writing any sort of business writing, I would certainly be much more conventional in such things. I don't really feel that the audience who reads my writing is necessarily looking for conventional. And if my voice is a bit original, I don't think that hurts anything. A little unusual, I don't think that hurts anything. Um, and I have tended to stick with that. When we go through editing a manuscript, one of the things that, at least for me, I am looking for is that it does, in fact, reflect my authentic voice, that it says what I want to say clearly. And, I have found on a number of occasions that that first draft may seem very clear to me, but might not be clear to everyone else. And this is a matter of some importance. And it was one of the interesting questions that came up in Reverend Don's books of questions where we were trying to keep that spoken voice. But there were still some places where I felt certain sentences had to be altered to make clearer what I was trying to say, because, of course, in writing, you don't have tone of voice. And I could see exactly what I said in video and why it might have been clearer to understand because of how I said it, but you don't have that in writing. One of the things I've found very interesting about the things I've written is how many people have told me that when they read my writing, they hear my voice. And because they've watched programs like this, they've watched my videos, and I do have a very distinctive way of expressing myself. And I think if you want to be a writer, and you want to be a writer of any consequence, and you're not doing, well, for want of a better way to put it, business writing or um, perhaps commercial writing, I should say, for advertising and the like, having an individual voice is very important. Not sounding like everyone else is very important. And, it's been pointed out to me that with most authors, most authors with good followings, you can tell they're writing simply by reading it. They have a way of writing, a way of speaking that expresses itself in a certain way. And hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And I think this is very important to the writer's art. One of the things that I like about um, some of the advances that we have in technology at the moment that help us to correct um, grammatical and other issues in our writing is that they also tend to flatten our voice if we allow them to. And so my recommendation to you, if you are a writer, by all means, use grammar programs and so forth, but use them with some care and understand that um, you're not always looking for just the most conventional way to say something. And, I always thought it was a bit of a compliment if someone had to go and get a dictionary um, to read certain parts of my books. I did try to make everything accessible as far as I could, but I did also make it a point to sometimes use and hopefully explain words that they might not be familiar with. Because, when I was a child, God, and I'm going to date myself extensively here, but I used to take the Reader's Digest for almost exclusively their vocabulary section. And Lady Crystal and I both loved that. My mother loved it also, because we were constantly wanting to grow our vocabularies, constantly wanting to understand better how to express ourselves, how to work with the beauty of language. And I think that although many of the programs currently in favor tend to flatten language, I think that ultimately they're going to make the individual voice more valued by making it more rare. So I strongly recommend developing your personal voice if you want to be a writer. And Mary says, I always did the vocabulary test. I loved those. Um, there are a number of things that I follow even today that deal with vocabulary. One of them is Auntie Bev, who frequently does vocabulary words and their meanings. Um, and there are a few others, but it's very rare that I don't know the word these days. And unfortunately, sometimes I also recognize that the expert is wrong. Um, because they're using the most common version, not necessarily a complete version, but that's um, a relatively minor matter in some of these things. But I will notice that sometimes the vocabulary meanings given are incomplete, but typical for people's ordinary usage. And hello to Janice in the chat room. It's good to see you. And Janice says, good afternoon. My dad used to quiz us with his dictionary. That's wonderful. Good job to your dad. Nothing is going to help um, a person more, I think, with their education and therefore with their lives than expanding their vocabulary and their knowledge in general. And if you expand your vocabulary, you're going to expand everything else too. Renee says, I loved the vocabulary tests in Reader's Digest. Um, I think that this is such an important thing. And I try not to be pedantic in the way that I deal with vocabulary, but I have my moments. Get me started on the relationship between the words pentacle and pentagram, and I'll show you how pedantic I can be, even though I recognize that for many people these words are interchangeable or have various vernacular definitions that seriously are different from the actual more official definitions, and that's okay. It's the same with pronunciation. I often talk about how most words have multiple pronunciations depending on the dialect of the language that you're speaking, and why get upset about. And particularly in the metaphysical world, a lot of people are using words that they only know through books. They've never heard anyone say or heard them say correctly. So why should we be upset if pronunciations are perhaps imprecise or not perfect? It's much better that you know and use the word. And again, you just have to stop and think about the differences between American English and British English as the simplest example of how widely pronunciation varies in the English language, and also sometimes the meaning of words. One of the things that I find interesting, um, one of the channels I follow talks about the difference between American and British English and how different their terms are for certain things. But I grew up in most cases using both. I don't know if that's unusual or not. Um, I will say that I think for the most part, the United States uses um, older forms of English that have developed further in the United Kingdom and tended to stay more traditional here. If you ever hear people doing 16th century accents for Shakespeare, which has become a fashionable thing in the last few years, you'll notice that many American accents are much closer to that 16th century accent. Because, of course, that's when a large number of foundational things happened here. Of course, the other thing is that many Americans are actually speaking, I guess I'd say, probably a mixture of English and Scots, um, and do not realize that there is a separate Scottish language. that has its own rules. The one I always like to refer to is the term ask versus axe. Ask is English, axe is Scottish, and they were both common in Middle English, but they separated as those two languages separated. But many of the people who came to this country came from Scotland, and they were speaking Scots. Mary says, I was reading a lot of British mysteries at one point, and my language got British back then. Yes, it will. And there's a term for intermixing many different languages and dialects, and that is macaronic. And I think that you certainly can take that to the point that it becomes difficult for anyone to understand. But I think mixing a wide range of words into your vocabulary certainly doesn't hurt anything. Um, and I think that developing a more gracious way of speaking is not a bad idea, not a bad thing. I mean, grammar programs hate the fact that I tend to phrase things in certain ways, and some of them I've changed. But those things tend to come from that older way of speaking. And hello to Shundai in the chat room. It's good to see you, Shundai. Um, I, in addition to everything I was talking about earlier, another big influence on me as a young person were old films. Um, and those films from the late 1920s, when talking film first arrived, the 1930s as it matured, these were often shown in my childhood when dinosaurs ruled the earth as late night films on television because they could be gotten for low amounts of money and rebroadcast. But watching that um, gave me um, a broad exposure to accents that you don't hear today. Um, in addition to what was already in my family had many different accents going on. My father's accent really makes no sense. I'll never know where he got it. And Steve says, I love the old films. I still do too. And Shundai says, thank you. It's very good to see you. Brightest blessings to you and yours. Thank you, Shundai. Um, I the thing about the old films, and I find that some younger people, because they did not have that experience of being exposed to them from youth, um, can find it difficult to deal with the different way that things are sometimes presented. But I find that part of the charm of early cinema. Um, they that if you watch historical film, you can see how they developed the use of soundtracks, um, the way that people interact on film, which at present I think has been um, curtailed in some ways to an unnatural extent to where people they say only what's necessary, but it becomes sometimes an unnatural way of speaking, which unfortunately then becomes the natural way of speaking. If you watch older films, you sometimes see a more natural expression, or at least for that time. Um, I I don't have a lot of time to watch films these days, but I have currently a plan to watch The Return of Philo Vance one day soon from I want to say 1929. And if you don't know who Philo Vance is and you love mysteries, Philo Vance was one of the main mystery characters of the 1920s and early 1930s, who is pretty much lost from the modern mystery canon. Um, when you when you watch if you watch things like the old mystery series with Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, people remember those detectives, but they've largely lost Philo Vance, and that's partly because he was much a character of the time, um, but very popular in that day. So I'm interested to see how much this film actually reproduces the literary character. One of the things about the literary character, which was true of many of those golden age detectives, is that the writing was it was coded to make the character very gay, um, but certainly never said. And Philo Vance was probably one of the gayest of the detectives of the day, um, even though this is never bluntly expressed, which is typical of the time. Um, and this was true for certain other detectives, and I find it interesting that certain modern takes on those detectives try to go out of their way to downplay that aspect. But that's another show. And Mary in the chat room says, I miss subtle romance in movies. Um, that's a very interesting subject, and it's true. Romance has been handled in some very unrealistic ways in movies. One of the things that I came to see as rather objectionable in those older movies that I loved is that people could never seem to have casual affairs, but they would fall in love in 24 hours and get married, which I think is probably one of the stupidest things that a person can do under normal circumstances. But that was the illusion that the movies were giving to people. Um, the idea of a subtle romance that takes time to build um, requires a lot more storytelling. But you do see it sometimes, and I think that is very good. And also, in many of the old movies, they couldn't be explicit. And so they had ways of telling you that, well, yeah, certain things were happening, but they couldn't quite say it. And that could be quite artistic in sometimes very beautiful ways. And although I certainly approve of realism in movies in this way, I also agree that some of those subtle touches were much more moving on occasion. Um, when the camera cuts away from the romantic couple to the draperies blowing in the breeze, or the waves crashing on the shore, sometimes that actually told you more than having everything happen explicitly on the screen, because it was making an illusion that referred to more than just the physical act, but also tried to capture the nature of their emotions. And I think there's room for both of these things. I am not a believer in in false modesty, um, but I am a believer in poetic language. And and Mary says nothing against casual affairs, but I miss the subtle touch, and I agree. Um, it certainly is something that is often not done today, even where it could be and perhaps should be, because it's not forced. One of the things I love early television, I love early movies, and I love their low production values. Our modern CGI and everything else is wonderful and impressive, but often it can be used rather lazily. In the early days of these media, it took a lot of creativity to express certain concepts, and the fact that they were able to do so is remarkable in itself, and sometimes far more creative than what you will see today. What many people consider the acting in The Passion of Joan of Arc from, I believe, 1927, might have been 26, to be the best acting performance in the history of cinema. But one of the interesting things about that film, which comes from the early days of cinema, is if you don't know the era in which it was made, it's hard to spot. Um, the way it was filmed is very modern, but the way that they handled things, like the battle scenes near the end required a great deal of creativity to pull them off, but they did. Um, and Mary says, I've often seen special effects that really deserved a better movie. And that's true too. Uh, that's very true too. But with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining me and discussing all of these interesting subjects about writing and film and language. And I will be back on Monday, and we will continue our discussions about the witchness of the why and all things interesting and and enriching to our minds. Thank you for joining me, and let us close with our prayer, as we always do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives and for the wonderful things in the world that we live in. We ask you to bring us new experiences and new knowledge to help us to grow and to blossom in this life, as well as new adventures to enrich our experiences. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. Knowing you're always with us, we thank you still from respect for your presence now, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.